Hello and welcome to Topic 1, Lecture 2. And in this topic, we're going to be taking a look at judicial decision making. Okay, so what are we going to be learning about in this lecture? Well, first we're going to do a quick overview of the Supreme Court, just so we make sure that everybody understands the makeup of the Supreme Court and some of the powers of the Supreme Court. Then we're going to take a look at the two main categories of factors that influence judicial decision making. Legalism and realism, and we're going to focus on the first of those two, legalism. So let's get started. Okay, so building off what we talked about in the last lecture, we're going to talk about how the federal judiciary is established by the Article 3 of the Constitution and what that means. What that means is that Article 3 of the Constitution says that judicial power of the United States shall be vested in one Supreme Court. And so basically, Article 3 establishes the Supreme Court of the United States. It also tells us that the Supreme Court hears cases that deal with federal law and the Constitution. And so as the Supreme Court of the United States of America, the vast majority of the cases that the Supreme Court hears revolve around issues of constitutionality. As I mentioned in the last lecture, the Supreme Court does have original jurisdiction in some cases. That is that they can hear cases for the first time in some matters, but mostly they're an appellate court. Usually the Supreme Court hears cases that have already been handled by other courts. Now, when it comes to the size of the Supreme Court, the size of the Supreme Court is it's not set by the Constitution. Rather, the Congress, federal law, establishes the size of the Supreme Court. The size of the Supreme Court has varied over time, from 6 to more than 6. But since 1869, the federal law has established the size of the Supreme Court as nine justices. And so today, and as we have had since 1869, we have one Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court and 8 Associate Justices. So how are Supreme Court justices selected, and what are the terms of their service? Well, a lot of you are probably thinking about the selection of Supreme Court justices because, as you know, and I posted an announcement about this over the weekend, that Associate Justice Stephen Breyer has announced that he is going to retire at the end of this term. And so what that means is that President Joe Biden will have his first opportunity, and maybe his only opportunity, we'll see how things play out, to nominate a justice to replace Stephen Breyer. And so justices are nominated by the President of the United States. And so when a vacancy arrives, whether that's through a retirement or as was the case with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she died on the court, that when there is a vacancy, the president will nominate somebody to replace that person. And then the Senate has the power of confirming the president's nominee. And so justices are nominated by the president and they are confirmed by the Senate. Right now in the Senate, that the filibuster doesn't apply to Supreme Court confirmations. So all the Senate needs to have is they need to have 51 votes or 50 votes. And then in the case likely with the replacement of Justice Breyer, that the tie will be broken by the Vice President of the United States, who serves as the President of the Senate. The appointment is for a lifetime term, and so that's why it's such a big deal when a president gets to nominate a Supreme Court justice, because particularly if they're young, they could influence the decision-making of the court for decades to come. But Supreme Court justices can be impeached. They have been impeached in our history, but it happens incredibly infrequently. There aren't any qualifications regarding who can be appointed to the Supreme Court. There are no qualifications, at least in the Constitution. But as a matter of norms and protocols, that there are sort of some expected qualifications that those who are nominated by the president will hold. Usually, obviously, they're lawyers, justices, and most frequently they serve in the Circuit Court of Appeals and the federal appellate courts. That's a likely pathway to serve on the Supreme Court. but there's nothing in the Constitution that outlines those qualifications. And just another thing to keep in mind that the Supreme Court session starts on the first Monday of October of every year, and it ends in June or July. During the pandemic, it used to always end towards the end of June with a flurry of decisions coming out. But because of the pandemic and changes that have been made to the court in terms of oral arguments and deliberations, last term we got decisions in July, and we very well may get those this coming July. And so right now we're in the 21-22 term of the Supreme Court. It started in October of 2021 and will end in June or July of 2022. So what's the makeup of the current court? Well, there's a picture. Every time there's a new justice that gets added to the Supreme Court, they actually take a class photo, and that's the most recent class photo that shows the addition of the newest Justice Amy Coney Barrett. There on the here. Let me get my magic pen out. Right here on the right-hand side of the screen. And so the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is John Roberts. He's there right in the middle. And that a court will be named after the Supreme Court Justice. And so right now we are on the Roberts Court. And John Roberts has been the Chief Justice since the early 2000s. He was nominated by President George W. Bush. Before that, the Chief Justice was William Rehnquist. Before that, Berger, etc. And so courts are named after the Chief Justice. And so that currently we're in what's known as the Roberts Court. And you'll see in your textbook that the textbook will refer to the Rehnquist Court, the Berger Court, the Warren Court, etc. And so in 2021, we're in the Roberts Court. We'll just name the justices. This is Justice Brett Kavanaugh. This is Elena Kagan. This is Neil Gorsuch. This is Amy Coney Barrett. This is Sam Alito. This is Clarence Thomas. In the middle is the Chief Justice, John Roberts. This is the justice that is retiring, Stephen Breyer. And this is Justice Sonia Sotomayor. And this slide shows you the makeup of the Roberts Court. And so at the very top, and again, let me put my magic pen on here. On the very top, it starts with the Chief Justice. The Chief Justice is the most senior member of the court, even though they haven't served on the court, the longest member of the court. As it says here, John Roberts joined the court in 2005. He was appointed by George W. Bush. But he is the most senior member because he is the Chief Justice. And then the other justices are known as associate justices. And this is the list going down in terms of seniority. So the justice that's been on the court the longest is Clarence Thomas. And all the way on the bottom here, Amy Coney Barrett is the least senior justice. And so you can see the names here. You can see their ages. That the three most recent appointments to the court, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, Barrett, they were all appointed by President Donald Trump, and they're all quite young, in their 50s. And I think Amy Coney Barrett's not even in her 50s. She's 48 years old, born in 1972. And so but the oldest member of the court was Breyer, and he is aged 82. Okay. And so it also shows you what their background is, where they came from. And a lot of them came from the Circuit Court of Appeals. They were appellate justices. Although Elena Kagan, appointed by President Barack Obama, served as the Solicitor General for President Obama. And then on this slide part here in this column, it shows you the president that appointed these different justices. Okay, so now that you've had a quick overview of the makeup of the Supreme Court and who are the sitting justices on the current court, we're going to turn our sights now to what the majority of what we're going to be talking about in this lecture, which is the factors that influence judicial decision making. In other words, what are the factors that influence how sitting justices make their decisions when it comes to cases that are being heard by the court? And so, every term there are major cases that are waiting to be decided by the Supreme Court, and that's where we are at in terms of in the term. That there are many cases that have been heard by the court. There have been oral arguments, writs of certiorari have been granted, written briefs have been submitted, and oral arguments have been made. But we're still waiting to see what the decision of the court will be. And one of the major decisions that is pending in the Supreme Court deals with abortion, and I'm sure that many of you have heard about it because this case is getting a lot of attention in the media because it's really going to be a landmark case depending on how the Supreme Court decides. And the name of the case is Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health. And this is a case that deals with an abortion law in Mississippi. So in Mississippi, the state legislature of Mississippi passed a law, and the law bans most abortions after 15 weeks. And this is a very interesting case because based on past decisions of the Supreme Court, in particular Roe v. Wade, but then also the Casey versus Planned Parenthood in Pennsylvania, both cases that you're going to be learning about this semester. Those cases say that a woman has a right to an abortion within the before viability, so that you have a constitutional right to have an abortion prior to viability of the fetus. And the viability of the fetus usually happens around the 23rd week of the pregnancy. And so this law is a real departure from the decisions in Roe and Casey, because it basically says that you can't have an abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy. And so the question is, we don't know how the Supreme Court's going to rule in this case, but for our purposes today, as we're thinking about factors that influence judicial decision making, what do you think are some of the factors that are going to influence how the justices will decide? Will it be the justice's personal ideology? A lot of what you hear about the court recently is that it is a decidedly conservative court. There are only 3 liberals on the court: Sotomayor, Elena Kagan, Justice Breyer, and the rest of the court is quite conservative. And conservatives are generally against abortion. So do you think that a justice's personal ideology will weigh in terms of factors that they consider in terms of making decisions? Do you think what role will the text of the Constitution play? Will they look at the Constitution and ask themselves, is there anything in the Constitution that says that you have a right to an abortion or a right to privacy? Spoiler alert, there's nothing in the Constitution that says that you have the right to privacy. It's not explicitly stated. Do you think they'll consider the costs and benefits of the impact of their decision? Since 1972, women have had a right to an abortion prior to viability. This case would really change that, and that would really change the way that we as a society think about abortion law. And might there be a cost associated with that decision? Might there be a benefit? Is that something that they might weigh? Will they look at past rulings of the court? How has the court ruled in the past? So all of those are factors that judges take into consideration when they're making decisions. And the point of this lecture is to help you get a better understanding of what influences judicial decision making. So there are 2 main categories of factors that influence judicial decision making. One factor is how justices interpret the Constitution, and that's what's known as legalism. And let me just put both of these up here, and then we'll talk about these separately. The other category is what's known as realism, political factors. That is that there are certain preferences, value preferences, strategies, or external factors that the justices take into consideration when they are making a decision on the court. Now, this lecture is going to focus primarily on legalism, but you're responsible for learning about realism, and we'll talk about realism here before we move on to talk about legalism. But you are responsible for knowing both of these factors. And I would be more than happy for you to attend office hours. In fact, I think our office hours this week are going to focus on going over the political factors that influence decision making, since we're not going to have an opportunity to talk about that in lecture. When it comes to interpreting the Constitution and making decisions on cases that are being considered by the courts, justices aren't supposed to let politics or political factors influence their decision making. Justices are supposed to be insulated from politics. They're not elected. They don't get, they're not reelected. That they are appointed and that they serve a lifetime on the court. And so they're really not supposed to let their political ideologies or public opinion or the views of interest groups influence their decision making. That's that second category, realism, right? They're not supposed to do that. But you know what? Let's be realistic. That's why it's called realism. They do let their personal ideologies, that external factors like interest groups and public opinion, it does influence their decision making. So on the one hand, there's a realism. The political factors do influence decision making. However, that what justices are supposed to do is that they're supposed to only let the law and the Constitution influence their decision making. That's what they should do, not what they do. And that's what legalism is, that first category. And so legalism is a legal method that guides interpretation, right? In other words, and these are the categories that we're going to be taking a look at. Originalism is a really good example of legalism. Then how you decide a case is that you try to figure out what the intent of the framers were, or what the original meaning of the Constitution is. Doesn't matter what your own personal preference is or what your own ideology is, but it's like, what did the framers intend? And you use that to drive your decision making. It's supposed to be outside the dirty world of politics. And so we're going to look at legalism in particular, but make sure you read about realism in your textbook. That it is very true that some justices are more liberal and some justices are more conservative. Your textbook defines the difference between what it means to be a liberal judge. When it comes to civil liberties and liberalism, you're more likely to side with the individual than the state. If you're a liberal when it comes to economic regulations, you're more likely to say the state can regulate the marketplace, right? And so sometimes justices are liberal. Sometimes justices are activists, so that they say that if there is an unconstitutional law, they're active, they want to overturn it. They view the court as being active. Other justices, that their political factors is, oh no, you shouldn't interfere with the legislature. They want to be more restrained. Those are sort of personal preferences. Also, public opinion and the role of interest groups through amicus briefs also influence decision making. So make sure you read about realism. But let's turn our sights to legalism. Okay, so when it comes to legal interpretation, legalism, and court decision making, there's several different categories of legalism or legal viewpoints that justices employ to help them as they decide cases on the court. There's originalism, textualism, structural analysis, stare decisis, pragmatism, and polling jurisdictions. And we're going to look at all of these in this lecture except for structural analysis. Structural analysis is a little bit difficult to understand, that I'd be more than happy to answer questions about it in our office hours if you're interested. But when it comes to the application of the legalism for our discussion this week, we're only going to be taking a look at originalism, textualism, stare decisis, pragmatism, and polling jurisdictions. And that's why we're going to cover those 5 methods within this lecture. All right, the first method for legalism, legal interpretation of the Constitution, is what is known as originalism. And many of you might be familiar with the concept of originalism. It's pretty popular right now. Originalism is this idea that you want to figure out what the founders, what the framers of the Constitution had in mind, what their intentions were, and that you use their intentions to employ and to influence how you decide a case that's pending before the Supreme Court. Now, there are two aspects of originalism. One is what I was just talking about, original intent. And what original intent means is that you're basically trying to figure out what did the founders mean to achieve when they wrote the phrase in the Constitution. In other words, what was the intent of the framers? And when you figure out what the intent of the framers was, then you employ that intent in your decision making. The other feature of originalism is what's known as original meaning. And original meaning is basically that you look at the words in the Constitution, the clauses in the words, and you ask yourself, what did these words mean in 1789 when the Constitution was, created and ratified and ultimately employed. And so originalism is really trying to say, look, it doesn't matter what I believe, but it matters what the framers believed. It matters what the people in 1780 believed, and that what these words meant that are in the Constitution, what it meant to those people. And if you can figure out what that meaning is, then you can use that meaning to drive your decision making. To figure out original intent, you would examine the writings of the framers. There were proceedings to the Constitutional Convention that you would look at. You might look at their letters of those who attended the Constitutional Convention, and you might say, when they wrote the phrase, the right to bear arms, like what did that mean to those who were at the Constitutional Convention? Or with the Bill of Rights, what did that mean to the Congress and to James Madison as they, created the Bill of Rights to be added to the Constitution? You could also look and examine dictionaries and the use of words in newspapers or in pamphlets to try to figure out what the original meanings of those words were. And so it's really kind of trying to get back into the mindset of those in the early 18th century and use that mindset to drive your decision making. Really good example that we're going to be reading later on in the semester has to do with the Second Amendment and the majority opinion that's written by Justice Antonin Scalia in the landmark case DC versus Heller. So DC versus Heller is a case that has to do with the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, and whether the right to bear arms is an individual right or whether it's a right that's granted to the states. When you read that decision, which you will be doing, you'll see that Justice Scalia spends tons of time in his decision going back and parsing each word that's in the Second Amendment to see what that word means from the early 18th century perspective, and he uses that to drive his decision making. So it's a really good example. Scalia was an originalist. It's a really good example of that. There are some benefits to originalism that your textbook talks about. And again, this is just sort of an overview, so you're going to want to make sure you go in the textbook and dig more deeply. One benefit is that there are these constitutional truths that you can find, and it allows for value-free decision-making. It takes the preferences of the justice out of the way, and it inserts the preferences of the framers. And so it's seen as sort of a value-free decision-making. The drawbacks is it really best or even just to interpret 21st century legal controversies through 18th century understandings of the world? Remember what the 18th century was like, right? Slavery, women weren't allowed to vote. They weren't seen as full citizens. That you had to own property and land to participate in the political system. Is that really... that's the intent of the framers? Is that something that we want to use to drive the decision making for these complex legal subjects in a completely sort of different world? So benefits and drawbacks. Okay, let's look at the next method, which is textualism. And textualism places emphasis on the specific words that are used in the Constitution. It's another word for textualism is literalism. And so the thinking from this perspective is you don't need to go beyond the words of the Constitution to find meaning. You just basically say, these are the words, and you apply the words as written. So here's a concrete example, and it's an example they talk about in your textbook. The First Amendment says that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. If you interpret the First Amendment in that way and you're a textualist, you basically say it means no law. Congress can't make any law that abridges your speech. So you can't make laws that abridge violent speech. You can't make laws that abridge pornographic speech. You can't make laws that are threatening the life of the president. Speech is speech. No laws means no laws. Furthermore, a textualist would look at the word speech and they'd say that means that you can't make laws that are regarding utterances of the mouth, not like burning a flag or wearing an armband. Those aren't speech. Speech means coming out of your mouth, words, you make a speech, right? And so textualists are literalists. They look at it, they interpret the Constitution according to the words that are in the Constitution. There are some benefits. It's value-free and precise decision-making. You basically say it doesn't matter what I believe, it matters what the words are in the Constitution. And so it can give you some consistency in your decision-making and outside of any personal preferences. The drawbacks assumes that language is precise, so they give us some examples in the textbook about how words like sanction can mean both like prohibitions and also agreements with, so which, meaning do you go with? And it also is like weird positions, right? So you could be like totally free speech when it comes to words that come out of your mouth, but you're not freedom of expression, which seems a little bit contradictory. The next method is stare decisis, let the decision stand. And so if you use this method for decision making, it means that the justices decide a current case based on previous decisions of the court. And those previous decisions of the court are known as court precedent. So basically, when a case comes before you, you ask yourself, how has the court ruled in this case in the past? You find out what that ruling is, and you apply that ruling. The stare decisis means let the decision stand. So if there's a decision from the past, you let that stand and you apply it moving forward. Good example of that is Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade, decision saying that women have a constitutional right to an abortion, and that right can't be treaded upon prior to the viability of the fetus. That's settled law. It's decided law. So when new abortion cases come to the Supreme Court, you just basically say, what has the court said in the past about these cases, and apply that moving forward. The real benefit of stare decisis is that it's predictable and stable. That, if you know that the court has said that, for example, the exclusionary rule, evidence that's illegally collected cannot be admissible in court, then it's predictable. Evidence cannot be, admitted into court if it's been illegally collected. And so there's going to be like sort of a predictability over time. Same with abortion rights. People say have a right to an abortion before viability. That's predictable. It's knowable. State legislatures can make laws accordingly. And so offers some stability in terms of the method of stare decisis. The drawbacks is just because it's a past ruling doesn't mean that it's a good ruling or that it's a just ruling or that it's a right ruling. And so people would look at Roe v. Wade and say, yeah, that's the precedent, but that was wrong. It was unjust. Didn't take into consideration the rights of the fetus, right? Didn't take into consideration changes in our understanding of viability, right? You look at Plessy versus Ferguson, landmark civil rights case that basically Plessy versus Ferguson said that you can have separate train cars for white people and black people. As long as those train cars are equal, it doesn't matter whether or not they're separate. Well, that was overturned by the Brown versus Board of Education, as it should have been, because Plessy versus Ferguson was not just, and it didn't understand the fundamental issues of equality. And so that's some of the drawbacks of using stare decisis. All right, we have two more to go, pragmatism and polling jurisdictions. Pragmatism says, look, there's many ways of interpreting the Constitution, but go with when I'm interpreting the Constitution, says this justice who is guided by pragmatism, they say, make a decision that results in the least amount of harm, okay? And that's what pragmatism is. It basically does a cost-benefit analysis. And the justice says, if I rule in this way, what are the benefits of this ruling and what are the costs of this ruling? And if the benefits of ruling a certain way outweigh the costs, go with it. But if the costs outweigh the benefits of the way I would rule, then you should rule in the other direction. So you should make your decisions based on a cost-benefit analysis. Your textbook uses the example of reasonable searches and the exclusionary rule. The exclusionary rule is basically saying that if evidence is improperly or illegally collected, it can't be used in court. I referenced that on the last slide. That's what the exclusionary rule is. The thinking is that it tells law enforcement that they got to follow the rules, they've got to follow the law, they can't engage in unreasonable searches, because if they do, whatever they find can't be used in a court of law. Well, sometimes searches are unreasonable, but because of maybe an error. So like, let's say you get a warrant and the warrant isn't properly dated, or it has the wrong last name on it, like a misspelling. You could say, well, that warrant wasn't, valid, and, that you can't use that warrant. So anything that was found during that warrant must be inadmissible. It's subject to the exclusionary rule. Well, you could say that the costs associated with that are high. For one, the law enforcement, they were in good faith. They weren't trying to trick anybody. They weren't trying to knowingly engage in an unreasonable search. And not only that, but all the contraband that was found, like from a drug dealer or from a murder, it can't be used, and therefore that murderer will not be held accountable for their action. So if you're a pragmatist, you might say, you know what, you're going to make a little bit of an exception. Say, you know what, good faith exception, that warrant, sure, by the letter of the law, it wasn't legal, but there was no malfeasance that was going on in terms of creating that warrant. So that would be a good example of pragmatism. The benefits are that the bad consequences are important and costly, and you should take those into consideration. But as your textbook points out, who are the judges to sort of determine, do they have the adequate tools necessary to assess the possible impact or costs of a decision by the court. All right, so we're our last method, polling jurisdictions. Polling jurisdictions, basically, if you use this method to decide a case, you would examine the practices of other jurisdictions as a guide for how to decide the case. And let's use the example of the death penalty. Let's say a death penalty case comes to the Supreme Court. And let's say that the question is whether or not putting somebody to death by a firing squad, whether or not that violates the Eighth Amendment, right? Which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Well, if you're using the polling jurisdictions method, you might say, okay, well, what does state law say about the use of firing squads? How many states allow a person to be put to death by firing squads? And if you say, 48 out of the 50 states allow for firing squads, you would say, well, I'm going to allow the use of the firing squad in this case. But if you say that only like 10 or 5 states allow it, you might say, nope, most states don't allow death by firing squad, so I'm not going to allow it. You could also look at death penalty in other countries. How many other countries have the death penalty? How many other countries put people to death by firing squad? And then you could use that information to drive your decision making in the case that's before you. The benefits of polling jurisdiction is that it keeps decisions in line with broader community practices. So the Supreme Court in their decision making wants to be sort of aligned with what states are doing, right? So if states are prohibiting a death by firing squad as a form of the death penalty, then the court should be in alignment with that. Plus, maybe the court should be in alignment with what other countries are doing as well. But a definite drawback from that is it doesn't really matter what states are doing or cities are doing or other countries are doing. That just because practices are a certain way doesn't mean that those practices are necessarily constitutional or right or just. All right, so let's bring it back to the case that we discussed at the beginning of the lecture, the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, the challenge to the Mississippi law that bans most abortions after 15 weeks. So based on what you've learned, you can think for yourself, how do you think a judge would rule in the case if they were an originalist? If they were looking at the intent of the founders and the meaning of the words in the Constitution, what would they think? Is there anything in the Constitution that it gives us insight into what the framers of the Constitution were thinking about when it came to the rights of abortion? What if the judge was influenced by precedent? How would they decide the case in Dobbs based on the precedent of Roe v. Wade? What if they were a textualist? There's nothing in the text of the Constitution that says anything at all about the right to privacy. So a textualist could sort of say the right to privacy doesn't exist in the Constitution. What if they were a pragmatist and they were looking at the over 50-year history of women knowing that they can have a right to an abortion? The costs of getting rid of that right might be incredibly great. And so pragmatists might think of the cost and benefits there as they were making their decision. So you can sort of think about that case in relationship to what we've just learned. Okay, so this week you're going to be engaging in an online discussion. And the topic 1 discussion will give you the opportunity to apply the concepts that we've learned in your chapter about legalism and in this lecture. The instructions are in the discussion. As you're reading through the discussion instructions, let me know if you have any questions. But basically, everybody in the class is going to be assigned one of the methods that we just talked about, not including structural analysis. I'm keeping that out of the mix. So you will be assigned either textualism or originalism or pragmatism, etc. And then you're going to use that method to explain how you would rule in a hypothetical case about the death penalty. So you'll use your method to explain how you would rule in the case. You're going to talk about what materials you would examine to guide your decision making. If you're an originalist, what would you look at to determine what the original intent of the founders was as it relates to the death penalty? If you're pulling jurisdictions, what would you look at, etc. And then you also would talk about that using your method, how would you rule in this case? And you're also going to talk about the strengths and weaknesses and describing your perspective. Then you'll also get an opportunity to evaluate the work of others. And so hopefully this lecture will help you in that discussion. Thanks for paying attention. I know this is a little bit longer than I usually like to make these lectures, but we had a lot of material to cover. So thanks for paying attention. I appreciate it, and I'll talk to you again soon.